Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, the Kremlin says it is impressed by President Donald Trump's position on ending the war in Ukraine. Well, Presidents Trump and Putin spoke by telephone yesterday and could be set to meet in person. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and some European leaders expressed discomfort at being blindsided, they say, by President Trump on ending the Ukraine war, insisting that they should have a seat at the negotiating table. And Hamas says it is committed to honouring the ceasefire deal with Israel, which in recent days has come under severe strain. Well, the next hostage prisoner swap is scheduled for this weekend. Hello and welcome to the programme. The US President Donald Trump held a lengthy telephone call on Wednesday with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Well, President Trump says that talks to end the war in Ukraine could start immediately. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says that Kyiv will not accept any peace deal unless it is involved. Well, we're hearing from the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte as well, who said at a press conference in Brussels that the alliance must now switch to what he called a wartime mindset. But the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth sought to clarify that US attempts to negotiate peace between Ukraine and Russia is, quote, certainly not a betrayal of the Ukrainian soldiers who've been fighting against the invading Russian forces during these last 3 years. Well, Hegseth emphasized that the US has made what he called an incredible contribution to NATO, highlighting that no other country is more dedicated to the Ukraine effort than the United States.
That the world is a safer place, a freer place when NATO is strong. And we certainly feel that way, and our investment reflects that. We echo your sentiments on defense spending. The president has said 2% is not enough, and we're going to argue that up to 5% is the necessary investment from NATO countries to ensure we're able to meet the threats of the future. There's one man in the world capable of convening the parties together to bring peace, and that's President Donald Trump, which he demonstrated yesterday in speaking to both Vladimir Putin and Zelenskyy, and bringing about, we believe, a durable, lasting peace on the continent, which his goal is to stop the killing and bring that peace, that it's in the interest of the continent and the United States.
Well, in response to the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, it seems that Ukraine's European allies are displeased with the Trump-Putin phone call. The German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius hit back, calling it regrettable that Washington had been making concessions to Russia before the peace talks had even begun.
Für uns, wie die Verhandlungen zu einem Frieden.
It is regrettable, and I say this as well, it's part of the truth, that the Trump administration has already made public concessions to Putin before the negotiations have even begun. From my point of view, it would have been preferable to talk about Ukraine's possible membership of NATO or the country's possible territorial losses only at the negotiating table and not to take them off the table beforehand.
The German defense minister speaking there. Well, like Germany and other European powers, the NATO chief Mark Rutte said it's crucial that Kyiv is closely involved in any talks about what happens in Ukraine.
What we have seen yesterday was the statements coming out of Washington, including, and you forget to mention that, his long phone call with President Zelenskyy. So we will see how this progresses from now on, step by step. Of course, it is crucial. We talk about Ukraine, that Ukraine is closely involved in everything happening about Ukraine.
Well, while some Ukrainians fear that the Russian President Vladimir Putin might try to undermine President Trump, Ukraine's Defense Minister Rustem Umerov thanked the NATO chief Mark Rutte for his support, highlighting that NATO is assisting them and training their troops. He also emphasized that Ukraine is still going strong. Meanwhile, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov appeared to be mocking Western bewilderment over the telephone call between the two presidents, calling it a case of two well-mannered people showing others how to do politics. Well, for more, we can speak now to Joel Rubin, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State under the Obama administration, who joins us from Washington. Thank you so much for speaking to us. We've had reaction from Moscow with the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov calling that conversation between President Trump and President Putin very important. We've also heard that Russia is impressed by Trump. But as far as Ukraine is concerned, is all of that a good thing, do you think?
Yes, it's it's a difficult moment right now to exactly understand where the negotiation will head. President Trump clearly had as a top agenda item for him the rapprochement with Russia, and he campaigned on that. So this is an important move by him to reach out. It's crucial, though, to ensure that there is a good deal, a sustainable one that provides security for Ukraine and maintains a line where Russia will not cross it, that the United States and Ukraine are synced up. And I think that's where President Trump now needs to make sure he's also focusing his efforts. It's clear that he wants there to be a calm. He wants there to be an end of this war, but there will not be a full end if Ukraine is not satisfied as well with what the arrangements are.
Yeah, I mean, the EU foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, says that Europe and Ukraine must be involved in the peace talks. She's also suggested that President Trump had been making concessions before the talks had even begun. I mean, are we talking about negotiation at this stage, or are we talking about appeasement?
Well, this is a different kind of negotiator. I'll have to give President Trump the benefit of the doubt on this. There is criticism of him, and there's a legitimate reason to criticize, for example, Secretary of Defense Hesham yesterday taking the NATO expansion into Ukraine off the table. But the reality is that that was not an easy sell, and it's not as if the Biden administration adopted that position either. And so while one could argue that's a bad negotiating tactic, one could also argue that it takes away an impediment to a negotiation and puts some realism into these discussions. But again, to the broader point, Ukraine was invaded by Russia, and Ukraine has lost territory to Russia and feels under threat, as well as our European allies and NATO allies do as well. So any sustainable peace that will truly be solid and verifiable is going to require Ukrainian agreement. Strong-arming Ukraine alone and allowing Russia to obtain the gains that they sought militarily will not guarantee that they won't go back at it again. And that's the big concern, that these negotiations, if they do succeed, and they're having negotiations, if I may add, for a number of years over the past decade plus between Russia and Ukraine off and on, if for these to succeed, it really does need Ukraine to be confident that they are safe.
But just to pick up on the point that was made by that EU foreign policy chief, I mean, this concession that Ukraine will not be joining NATO now or probably ever, as far as we understood from what was said to Vladimir Putin by Donald Trump. I mean, is it useful to put a key negotiating issue on the table like that and just give it away before negotiations have even started?
Typically, no. Typically, one doesn't want to give away what one could assume would be the ask of the other side. That might very well have been an ask of Vladimir Putin. But again, because there was opacity coming from the United States for a number of years and throughout about whether or not NATO should expand into Ukraine, it's not as if this was such a major concession, but there will be real questions. There will be questions about sovereignty in Ukraine and guaranteeing their sovereignty. And I do believe in the United States, we have an obligation to provide the kinds of security guarantees and support to Ukraine that we also provide to many other allies around the world, including South Korea, Israel, Taiwan, and others, where we make it clear that invading or crossing over into their territory will result in consequences. That is going to be the trickiest part of these negotiations. Will Donald Trump, will the president commit to true, robust security guarantees for Ukraine or not? If he does not, I think we're going to see a very flimsy deal come out from these negotiations.
Yeah, and everyone's putting a lot of accents on the fact that this has to be a lasting deal, because if it isn't, as you say, there may be further problems later on down the line. But we're in a situation right now where we've got European leaders saying we're being bypassed. It doesn't look and sound like the United States, Europe and Ukraine are all speaking with one voice. And that in itself, doesn't that show weakness?
Yeah, this is clearly an inversion of the diplomacy of the Biden administration, which focused on alliance engagement and alignment on policy before making assertions towards Russia in this case, and having a diplomatic program that had the grounding with alliances. And I think the challenge here, the problem here, is that we're seeing the weakness of the confidence that Donald Trump and his administration has in our NATO allies. I'd say that's misplaced. These are strong American allies and have been for decades. And it's crucial that we maintain support amongst the allies, and that gives us a better negotiating hand. That is, to your question, I think some of the bigger swirling concerns here in Washington is, are we going into a negotiation where ultimately we're making about us when it should be about NATO and Ukraine and us, of course, as well. But it's not an America-Russia problem. This is a Ukraine-Russia problem. And I think for President Trump, what we're watching is that he tends to want to make many international issues about an American unilateral set of activities, be it the Gaza takeover concept or taking over Canada or Greenland. And that inherently makes a weaker diplomatic hand for the United States.
Yeah, and so too does too much haste, because there was this campaign pledge of ending the war with a single phone call. And right. Clearly too, you know, everyone wants a quick end to this, not least the US president. But if there's too much haste...
They have one phone call, if I may, and the war is not over. So I think that campaign promise is that didn't hit the mark.
Right, it was one phone call. It didn't happen within 24 hours and didn't end the war. But to give President Trump his due, in his first administration, he told NATO allies they weren't spending enough on defense. We still have a situation where only 2/3 of NATO countries are actually spending the target 2% of GDP on defense. I mean, that's not good enough, is it?
No, it's not. But I will say that when President Trump left office, 6 NATO countries were hitting that target, and it's tripled roughly since then under the Biden administration through engagement. But President Trump, you know, he had the right point. And if this is going to motivate Europe to invest more in their own collective defense, that's all for the good and for the better, I think, from an American perspective, as long as we maintain strong, close ties with that NATO alliance. What we don't want is an untethering and a weakening of our relationship with Europe and with NATO. So putting more investment into collective defense is crucial, but it can't come at the expense of a retreat by the United States.
And there are those who are saying that the United States has got rather more pressing issues in the Asia-Pacific region to be focused on than Europe. And perhaps, you know, Asia-Pacific needs to be more of a priority. I mean, do you think that's a fair reading of the situation?
You know, this is a very reminiscent moment of 2001, in the early days of the Bush administration. And I was serving then in the government and in the earlier parts of my career. And at that time, the discussion was about Russia, Russia, Russia. And then within months, we saw September 11th occur. And so now, yes, we see China as the primary focus of many of the leaders in this administration, and rightly so. But I worry that there is a potential to look away from hot conflicts that are still very relevant to American national security, particularly in the Middle East, and of course, the one we're discussing with Russia. But the leadership and the staffing and the kinds of thoughts that are going into this administration are clearly focused on a more assertive posture towards China. The question is, of course, I should also add, will we be building on our alliances in Asia, or will we again be seeking to go it alone, which would make us weaker in dealing with a resurgent China?
And just lastly, we've had one telephone conversation. The Kremlin says there might be another one. There might be some face-to-face talks. How do you see things unfolding from here?
Well, it sure sounds like they want to meet. I wouldn't be surprised if there was more than this just one phone call. This is the one that we know of. And, you know, I think that with the recent release of the American who was unjustly detained as well by Moscow in recent days, we're likely to see an acceleration of moves on diplomacy. If there's one thing we've seen from this administration, is that they want to move fast on a lot of the most difficult and controversial items on their checklist. And so I would not at all be surprised if we saw a face-to-face meeting between President Trump and Vladimir Putin relatively soon.
Okay, Joel Rubin, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us here at Al Arabiya News.
Thanks, Tom.
Well, let's get more on the eventual negotiations. We can speak to Fred Fleitz, former Executive Secretary and Chief of Staff of the United States National Security Council under President Trump, who joins us now from Washington. Thank you very much for joining us once again on Al Arabiya News. In your opinion, what sort of a start are we off to with regards to these negotiations aimed at ending the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think it's looking very promising. We've seen President Trump, we're using the term in the U.S., flooding the zone with proposals to address domestic and foreign problems. We've seen that on Ukraine this week, where he named a high-powered staff of negotiators. He spoke to President Putin, President Zelenskyy, and Secretary of Defense Hesham gave an important speech at NATO in which he laid down what might be the outline for a U.S. ceasefire plan. So it looks like Trump is going all out to stop this war as soon as possible.
So why are we hearing from some European leaders and from Ukraine words to the effect that they're feeling blindsided by the Trump administration?
Well, it's sort of surprising to hear that because Trump's doing what he promised to do. And I think we're going to find in the way governments operate that most politicians say things and they don't do what they promise to do when they run for office. That's been an issue with Trump all along. He promises to do fairly dramatic things, such as when he moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, that in Israel. Many presidents promised that. None of them agreed to do it, except for Donald Trump. And I think we're seeing that here. He said he was going to do that. He said he was determined to end the war. And I don't know why people are surprised that he's keeping his word.
Well, I think they're surprised because he is reported to have given away concessions before the negotiations have even started. For example, what you'd have thought was a key trump card, a key negotiating gift, if you like, namely that Ukraine will not be joining NATO anytime soon. That's what we've heard from the Trump administration. I mean, why put that on the table before the talks have even begun?
I heard Europeans saying that that was a concession. It's not. That's been talked about for a year. General Keith Callaghan and I, who wrote a crucial paper on the Ukraine crisis, we wrote about that last spring. And given that it would take a unanimous vote to get Ukraine into NATO, this wasn't going to happen. So for Trump to raise that, that's not a concession. This is just complaining by Europeans. They don't want Trump to solve this crisis, but they don't have their own alternatives.
We saw Pete Hegseth there in Brussels saying, Washington isn't abandoning NATO, but Washington wants to see more effort from member states. Could you help us unpack that a little bit? What's he getting at here, do you think?
It was an important statement because it disproved what Trump's critics had been saying, that he was going to pull out of NATO. What Hegseth said is that Trump stands solidly with NATO, but he wants European states to take primary responsibility for the defense of continental Europe and to take primary responsibility for providing lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine because this is a European conflict. And the reason he said this is because he said the U.S. has global security challenges to deal with, and President Trump plans to prioritize the threat from China, which means we have to have a division of labor between Europe and the United States to deal with these global crises, and Europe has to take control of European security.
Yeah, and to give Mr. Trump credit, he was one of the first people to raise the alarm about the failure on the part of a number of NATO countries to meet that 2% of GDP target on defense spending. And to this day, only 2/3 of NATO countries are actually meeting the target. I mean, why have they not got the message so far, do you think?
I think European states have become dependent on the United States. They would prefer to spend their money on lavish social programs. But I might add that Trump said that 2% is not enough, and Hegseth said the same thing. Trump would like to see the minimum amount of defense spending to be raised to 5% of GDP, and he believes that European leaders have a responsibility to explain to their people the security threats facing Europe and why they must spend more in defense to deal with these threats.
So just to clarify what you're saying and to pick up on a couple of the points, you're saying that Washington basically thinks there's plenty of of other issues on its radar, notably in Asia Pacific, and Europe needs to stand on its own 2 feet. Is that basically the message?
The U.S. is not going to abandon Europe or abandon the defense of Europe under the Trump presidency. Hegseth was very clear about that. But it is going to prioritize countering the growing threat from China. And Hegseth tried to make the point that the U.S. has issues to deal with around the world, and defending Europe is no longer going to be America's priority. It will be something America is committed to, but we also have a commitment to the growing threat from China in the Asia Pacific.
And so for those Europeans who say, please, Mr. Trump, involve us in the dialogue, because if we speak with one voice, we'll be stronger and put us in a better negotiating position with Russia. I mean, are you saying that they don't really have a point here?
Well, I heard European leaders say that they're demanding a seat at the table for the negotiations. I understand there's an initiative underway to name an EU special envoy for the talks. I'm a little concerned that this would simply bog the talks down in the EU's bureaucracy and their inability to make decisions. I don't know what the president and his negotiating team will do on that point. My guess is the EU will not be allowed to name a representative, but I can't speak for the Trump administration on this.
And in terms of not speaking with one voice, I mean, couldn't it be argued that that's exactly what Russia wants?
Well, Europe already doesn't speak with one voice. And we saw with Trump's successful negotiations with Kim Jong-un at the Singapore summit, it was productive when the United States had one-on-one talks with a major adversary. We didn't include the Russians or the Chinese, which had been traditionally used in the six-party talks concerning the nuclear program of North Korea. I think concerning Russia and Ukraine, involving too many parties in the negotiations is going to make it harder to get to an end state. Now, I will tell you that there are intensive discussions right now involving General Kellogg and Vice President Vance and Secretary Hegseth and others with European states. Their views are being incorporated in the negotiations, so it is not fair to say that we're not speaking with one voice or the U.S. is not talking to its allies.
And we're just hearing from the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte saying that NATO needs to switch to a wartime mindset. He said that in Brussels. I mean, what do you think he's saying here? And do you think this is a reflection of some of the messages that you've been giving us there, perhaps messages that the Trump administration wants NATO to hear?
I think this was good news. It's consistent with President Trump's call that NATO members spend more in defense and be more realistic about growing security threats to Europe. So if this is the NATO Secretary General's position, it's something that'll be music to President Trump's ears.
Okay, and when the Ukrainian president says that Kyiv will not accept any peace deal by Russia and the United States without its involvement, where do you see this heading?
I don't know why the Ukrainian president would say that. Of course, Ukraine's going to be involved. I mean, it's sort of laughable that would even be contemplated. This will be a negotiation between the United States, Russia, and Ukraine.
Do you think the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth felt a bit like the odd one out at that NATO summit in Brussels? I noticed you on your Twitter feed, you posted that he was wearing a suit that was different from everyone else in the room. And I'm just trying to interpret your tweet and why you thought it was significant that he was dressed differently from everyone there. Do you think he's sort of a little bit the odd one out in that room of NATO member defense secretaries?
I can't comment on that. I'm not Pete Hegseth's fashion advisor.
Okay. So you're saying that Washington is not abandoning NATO, wants to see more effort. General Kellogg, for example, saying he wants stability restored to Europe and talking about meeting with allies and partners there. But is this a partnership of equals?
Well, it's a strong cooperative alliance that's been around since the end of World War II. Is it a an alliance of equals? Well, America's a superpower and the other members are not, but we've always worked together as close colleagues and allies, and we'll continue to do so.
And just lastly, I mean, it's really important that a good and lasting deal is struck. And there's a lot of emphasis on the word lasting, because if it doesn't last, then obviously it comes unraveled and it could embolden and incentivize Russia to have another go at taking another country's sovereign territory. What do you think needs to be done to ensure this is a lasting deal?
Well, Hegseth revealed some new details of what might be in a ceasefire or a peace plan. And one of them is the deployment of peacekeepers in Ukraine, which would be composed of European and non-European states, but not American troops, to try to be part of a security assurances arrangement to prevent war from breaking out again. I think that was a brilliant idea. It's something Kellogg and I mentioned in the paper we published last spring. And I think this is something European states are going to have to seriously consider. They're worried about the future of Ukraine. NATO membership is off the table. This is a way to make sure that Russia doesn't invade again without making a NATO member or invoking the NATO treaty.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for your time. Fred Fleitz, thanks again.
Be here.
Well, let's get some more analysis. We can speak to Boris Volodarsky, former captain in Russia's special forces, the GRU Spetsnaz, who joins us now from Vienna. Thank you so much for speaking to us once again. I'd just like to start by talking about this first presidential contact between Moscow and Washington in 3 years. President Putin and Donald Trump spoke on Wednesday evening. That's been described as a first step. What do you think the next step is?
As somebody said today, one telephone call will definitely not end the war in Ukraine. And the next step is, normally, logically, is to start negotiating. The first move should not have been actually to call Putin, because this is already incorrect move. The first call would be to call President Zelenskyy to discuss the situation with him. Calling Putin, Trump already showed his position that he is inclined more towards Russia than to the country which is being attacked by the aggressor.
Indeed, and we've also heard that Ukraine is not going to be joining NATO, at least that's what the Trump administration is saying. I mean, that sounds like another pretty big concession before negotiations have even got started. Some might say a gift to President Putin.
We should actually not take very seriously what members of the Trump administration are saying. And Pete Hegseth is definitely not a person who is quite responsible for his words. So I would not take that quite seriously, actually. We shall see what goes on further. What my understanding is that the Ukraine armed forces are the most developed, the strongest armed forces in Europe today. And this is more for the advantage of the NATO than for Ukraine, that Ukraine joins the NATO. And this is the additional defense for the NATO against Russia as a definite aggressor today.
I mean, do you see NATO getting involved in these talks? Or do you think, because we're given to understand that President Putin and President Trump might meet face to face at some point soon, some people saying it might happen in the Middle East. China's even offered to host a summit. Do you think President Trump's going to involve other parties, or do you think he's going to try and go this alone?
From what we are seeing today, and for what Trump's Secretary of Defense declared in Brussels, the Trump administration, President Trump, are not going to involve Europe at all. They are not going even to involve their representative in Ukraine, announced a couple of days ago. The delegation of the commission that Trump created and announced a couple of days ago does not even include him. So Trump is going to act completely himself because he wants to take all the laurels on himself. And we're all knowing that he's struggling to get the Nobel Prize of Peace. And this is his aim. So he's trying to arrange everything alone, as he promised to the American voters during the presidential campaign.
And how do you think that's likely to play out? Is that going to work to President Putin's advantage or to the advantage of Ukraine? What's your thinking?
what we see today is definitely the situation is greatly to the President Putin's advantage. How it's going to develop, we are going to see, I guess.
Russia currently controls about 20% of Ukrainian territory in the east and the south of Ukraine. I mean, realistically, how much of that territory do you see returning to Ukrainian control?
From the point of view of the situation as we see it today, Trump is not going to return any territory controlled by Russia today, even more. They are going actually to take over the territories that are not under Russian control today, and I mean in Zaporozhye, the region of Zaporozhye, Nikolaev, and others. And definitely the territory in Kursk, which is under Ukrainians today, Putin will certainly insist of the territory being returned to Russia without any concessions at all.
So you're painting a picture of a completely one-sided set of negotiations whereby Ukraine gets precisely nothing?
As far as it was announced until this date, Ukraine is not only going to get nothing at all, Ukraine is going to pay for the American help almost twice as the value of the American help during the last 3 years of war. That is, the American help to Ukraine is estimated roughly at about $200 billion, and President Trump, as we all know, demanded $500 billion from Ukraine. So what we see is Ukraine losing its territory, surrendering its territory to Russia, and losing the second part of this territory in terms of a huge debt to America.
So, I mean, do you see this whole conflict, these 3 years of fighting, as having simply emboldened Russia? And what might Russia decide to do next?
There is no any conflict at all. There is a direct and straight aggression of Russia, war of Russia against Ukraine. There is no conflict between parties. Russia attacked Ukraine and took a huge part of its territory. It's almost 30% of the Ukrainian territory. Russia is a definite aggressor and must be treated as such. And Putin is an international war criminal and also should be treated as such. And I'm very much surprised that President Trump is going to invite him as an honorable guest and valuable partner in negotiations to discuss anything at all. Putin is a criminal and should be treated as a criminal.
And in terms of the time frame, I mean, who was under more pressure to get to the negotiating table? I mean, there are Western sanctions that have been in place targeting Russia for the best part of 3 years now. I mean, was there public pressure in Russia for this war to come to an end?
There's no public pressure in Russia at all. Putin was certainly under pressure because the economic situation in Russia is dramatic. They are lacking basic weapons. Russia has to buy weapons from North Korea, has to bring in troops from North Korea, buying also weapons from Iran, seeking support in other countries, undeveloped countries. On the other hand, President Trump was under pressure because he announced that he's gonna make peace in Ukraine in 24 hours, then in 3 days, and more and more and more. And I don't think he's going to make that in the next 100 days, sorry.
Okay.
So both of them were under pressure.
All right. Well, we appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you very much indeed, Boris Volodarsky. Thanks again.
You're welcome.
We're going to turn our eye now to the Middle East because Hamas says it is committing to upholding the ceasefire deal with Israel. The group says it is going to maintain its side of that ceasefire and release more hostages this weekend as agreed. Well, Israel had threatened to end the ceasefire in Gaza if Hamas didn't return hostages as scheduled. Well, to discuss this further, we can speak to Ambassador Hesham Youssef, former career diplomat with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Egypt, who joins us now from Cairo. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Ambassador. Hamas now saying it will free hostages on Saturday as scheduled. Is the Gaza ceasefire looking more stable now than it did a couple of days ago?
Slightly. But the problem remains that the situation is precarious and the possibility of breaking down the ceasefire is a real possibility.
Yeah, because we were told earlier in the week by both President Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that if all the hostages weren't released on Saturday, then the ceasefire would be scrapped. I mean, has that threat gone away, do you think?
Well, this part of it has, because I think there is an agreement that the Trump administration has taken credit for, and the agreement has a schedule. And Hamas has been saying that they are willing to abide by the schedule, provided that Israel also abide by its commitments. So they were saying there are commitments by Israel that have not been implemented, and there are Israeli voices that have indicated that this is absolutely true. And I think there has been movement by the guarantors to ensure that commitments on both sides are being honored.
And of course, Egypt is taking a leading role in the diplomacy and has done for several months. Egypt's going to be hosting a summit of Arab nations later on this month. This week, Egypt has announced what's called a comprehensive vision for Gaza's reconstruction. Just tell us a little bit about what Egypt's vision is for Gaza's future.
Well, I think we have had a lot of experience in dealing with reconstruction in Gaza after the several wars that took place in the last 2 decades or so. So since 2007, Egypt has been working with the Palestinians and with the international community after the 2008-2009 war, after the 2014 war, and so on. And there were all kinds of efforts for reconstruction. Of course, the level of devastation this time around is much more grave. But this does not mean that you need to transfer all the people living in Gaza outside in order for Gaza to be rebuilt. You should use the people that are there in order to build their own country.
So it sounds as though you don't think that President Trump's plan to create the Middle East Riviera in Gaza is ever going to come to light.
Well, if the Palestinians want to build a Riviera, it's up to them. I don't think that it should be said that they should leave and somebody else would come and have a reconstruction plan and then would see who to allow back and who not to allow. I think Palestinians throughout the last 15 months have proven that they don't want to leave. And at one point in time, there were 1.6 million Palestinians very close to the Egyptian border. But had the first opportunity to go up north to the villages and cities, they just went in droves. So this is the current situation. I think Palestinians do not want to leave in general. Of course, there are some or many that would want to do so, but this has to be an individual choice. But it cannot be forced expulsion or forced displacement because there are many who have been saying, including the United Nations, that this would be a violation of international law. So we have to see what can be done. And I think this is the focus of Egypt and a number of countries in the region, including Jordan, including Saudi Arabia and others, that they see that reconstruction can take place while the population is there. And we have seen this happen in history time and again in all kinds of conflict areas that were rebuilt after devastating wars, starting from the Second World War until today. So I'm not sure that there has been a case whereby people were asked, all the people in an area were asked to leave this area in order for it to be rebuilt.
Yeah, your president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, said that such a plan to displace the Palestinian people of Gaza would be an injustice and one that Egypt wouldn't take part in. I think the Jordanian king in Washington brought with him a similar message. Do you think that message has now got through to Donald Trump, that this idea isn't going anywhere?
Well, I think what is more important is what is going to happen next. And I think the plan that Egypt is working on, as it was indicated by King Abdullah himself in Washington, along with other Arab countries, and this would be presented to the summit, I think this is the best answer to say, well, there are alternative plans and alternative ideas, and they have the support of a large number of countries in the Arab world, if it's the whole summit or perhaps less than that or whatever it is. There are alternative ideas, and we prefer this route. And we do not want to see Palestinians leaving their homes because it is quite complicated from all kinds of views, whether it's politically, legally, economically, socially, and so on. So this is not a small undertaking to say that just 2 million people have to leave and we will rebuild it and then ask people to come back. So we will see how this situation develops. But I think there are senior officials in the United States that have indicated that this is one of the ideas and that they are willing to consider other ideas. And I think this is the right approach for the administration, to be open to other ideas. And if there is a support, particularly from the region, that has to be involved in dealing with this situation in many years to come, I think that this should be the route that should be pursued.
And of course, you've got lengthy experience working with the Arab League. And what we've heard the last few days is the Arab world, all Arab leaders speaking very much with one voice with regards to what the future of Gaza is as far as they're concerned, that it's a territory for the people of Gaza to remain in and to reconstruct themselves. Do you think perhaps President Trump underestimated the resolve and the solidarity of Arab leaders?
Well, frankly, I have another difficulty. And the difficulty that I have is that reconstruction would not take place in an effective manner without linking reconstruction with a political process. And there are a large number of countries, especially donors, both in the region and beyond the region, who have been saying, we will not contribute to reconstruction if there is no political process, because we have been paying time and again for reconstruction in Gaza after several wars. And all what happened was for us to wait and see it destroyed once again. So I think the real challenge that I hope the Trump administration would be focusing on would be to see how this end of conflict or end of the war would be associated with a process for reconstruction and a process for ending the conflict once and for all, rather than to keep arguing over whether the whole population of Gaza should leave Gaza or not, because I think the biggest challenge is a challenge related to the political endgame rather than having all these differences around whether the people of Gaza should leave or not.
And of course, for construction and reconstruction to take place, construction vehicles are going to have to get into Gaza, and yet there are numerous construction vehicles blocked on the Egyptian side of the Rafah border crossing. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying that equipment isn't allowed to go through. So how can Gaza reconstruct if it's not going to be given the equipment to do so?
Well, my understanding is that it was agreed in the temporary ceasefire agreement that these construction vehicles would be allowed in, because also they will have to remove the rebels to get some roads cleared so that humanitarian assistance can go through, so that people can move, so that some effort can be done in relation to changing what the situation regarding the healthcare system and trying to see what hospitals can be modified and reconstructed or refurbished in one way or another, and so on. And my understanding is that this is part of the agreement, and this was one of the complaints that were leveled by Hamas in relation to the implementation. I think the role is for the guarantors to talk to Israel based on the understanding that they have from the negotiations. And I think the role of the United States here will be crucial, because I'm sure they do have an understanding of what exactly was agreed. And if this is part of the agreement, then all this equipment should be allowed in order for this to start clearing roads and dealing with some of the remaining remnants of bombs and so on, in order to allow people to be able to move around. Otherwise, the objective will be clear, that the objective is that Israel is not interested in the reconstruction of Gaza, and they are adamant that the only way to deal with the situation in Gaza is not related to reconstruction, and it is not related to early recovery. It is related to the fact that they want those Palestinians living in Gaza to leave. And this was one of the objectives that were mentioned at the outset of the war by asking Egypt to take Palestinians in Gaza while they deal with the situation with Hamas and so on. And that since the outset, Egypt said no. And Jordan at the same time also said that forced mass displacement, as far as they are concerned, will be considered an act of war. So these are the position of two key countries that have peace treaties with Israel, 45 years or so plus for Egypt and 30 years plus for Jordan. And they have been pillars for stability and security in the region. And they are trying to persuade Israel to do the right thing. And we hope that, cool minds prevail and that wisdom would prevail, and we think things would advance. If not, then sadly, I think what will happen is that violence will resume, and we will have a much bigger problem at our hand, while there are those in the Israeli army who are saying there are no more targets to destroy in Gaza. So this would be a very sad situation, and I hope that this would be avoided at all costs.
All right. Well, thank you. I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Ambassador Hesham Youssef. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, that is all we have time for on today's edition of Global News Today. Thanks for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.